If you've ever tried to live stream or maybe even watch a launch in person, you may have noticed one tedious problem. Rocket launches have a tendency to get delayed. Just this past week, the CSG-2 mission, launched by SpaceX, got delayed 5 times. So what is it that's causing all these delays? Oh, wait a second. I'll be right with you. A rocket launch is quite a complicated endeavor. There are many variables that have to align just correctly on launch day in order for there to be a successful launch. And any one variable could cause a delay or even a cancellation. So what are the main factors that contribute to launch delays? The first factor that you may be already aware of is the weather. Despite all their technical prowess and supreme engineering, even rockets are subject to the forces of nature. So what weather events are so powerful that they regularly delay rocket launches? Well, it turns out that one of the main culprits is actually just the wind. Orbital class rockets are particularly vulnerable to higher altitude winds up in the stratosphere. The reason for this is that the rocket is going relatively slowly by the time it gets to this altitude. Not really slow, I mean it's still going a little bit faster than the speed of sound, but when you compare that to the vector of the high altitude wind, sometimes there can be enough velocity that the rocket engine has to correct against that wind velocity, and it generates basically a torque in the rocket. Of course, the structure of the vehicle has to be able to withstand the force of that torque in order for there to be a successful flight. Otherwise, you could have a breakup of the rocket. Every vehicle has a unique structural limit where the compensation for the wind will be high enough to actually deform and destroy the structure of the rocket. And it turns out that rockets that are long and skinny tend to be particularly vulnerable. This is just because force applied over a longer lever arm generates more torque, which means it needs a more rigid structure to withstand the forces. Well, it turns out that SpaceX's rocket, the Falcon 9, is one of the longest, skinniest rockets out on the market. So that's why if you're used to watching SpaceX streams, they tend to get delayed quite often. But there's one other weather factor that can contribute to launch delays, and this would be heavy clouds that can form lightning. While rockets can survive lightning strikes, it's not usually something that engineers want to subject the rocket to if there's a chance that it could happen. One example of a lightning strike actually destroying the launch vehicle was during the Atlas Centaur launch in 1987. The vehicle was struck by lightning at T+38 seconds, which caused an erroneous signal to be sent to the thrust vector control system, calling for a hard pull to the right. Essentially, after a few seconds, the vehicle lost control and broke up. So this is why the go, no-go for weather criteria in today's launches make it a requirement that you can't have thick cloud cover where lightning could happen. One other factor that can cause launch delays is actually just the temperature. A lot of the structures and components that are used in launch vehicles require there to be very particular temperature conditions. For example, one problem that the space shuttle had was that it was unable to launch during temperatures that were near to freezing. When the temperatures got really cold, the O-rings that helped to seal the segments of the solid rocket boosters would actually get too cold to function properly, and sometimes they could leak. Launching during cold weather actually precipitated this problem in the 1986 launch of the Challenger, which ultimately ended in disaster. Some vehicles aren't quite as temperature sensitive as this though, but still, temperature is always something we have to think about. For example, for ASTRA's rocket Transcendence, we will also be having a temperature limitation on when we can launch. We're utilizing nitrous oxide as our oxidizer, and in order to have that at the pressure that we want it to be, in order to have the rocket functioning correctly, we need to have a temperature that's near 10 to 20 degrees Celsius. Since the only launch sites that we have available to us in Europe are mostly in northern locations, it seems like we're going to have a summer launch. The next reason why rocket launches tend to get delayed is actually just because of mechanical failures. This is especially a problem when rocket launchers are in development, because there's lots of problems that haven't been seen yet. Flight-proven vehicles like the Falcon 9, Atlas V, or Ariane 5 don't usually have delays for these types of reasons, but newer vehicles definitely do. One example of this is SpaceX's new vehicle, the Starship. If you've ever tried to tune into a live stream of the Starship, you'll definitely know the experience of waiting. But hey, that's just the price you pay for developing new systems. And as engineers, we're always happy to delay things rather than see things explode. Although explosions can be quite exciting, although maybe not to the shareholders. The last major reason for launch pad delays is actually one you may not have thought of. In order to have a safe launch, it's really important that the range in which the vehicle will be flying over remains clear, such that there's no risk that exploding rockets will fall on people. For this reason, launch sites are usually required to keep areas around the launch site and downrange from the launch site cleared of any people or infrastructure or anything like that. This is one reason why rocket launches commonly launch over the ocean, because it's relatively easy to enforce a zone where people aren't allowed to go in the ocean. But sometimes there are some compliance issues with these zone restrictions. The zone which is restricted is usually quite large, over thousands of kilometers squared, so it's usually quite hard to make sure there's no one in the area. There are numerous examples in the past of all kinds of recreational vehicles like sailboats, cruise ships, private airplanes, flying into these restricted zones and delaying the launch. Don't fly the way of a rocket, it's dangerous. This is actually what delayed the CSG-2 mission that was launched by SpaceX just a couple days ago. It turns out that a Royal Caribbean cruise ship ended up sailing right into the restricted zone. Come on guys, we're trying to launch rockets here! I wouldn't want to be that captain right now. There's probably a lot of questions that are being asked. So anytime you're around a launch site, maybe make sure to keep the restriction zone in mind so you don't accidentally delay a launch yourself. So there you have it. Those are the main reasons why rocket launches tend to get delayed. Of course, there are many more reasons why rockets get delayed, but I mean, if we talked about all of them, we'd be here all day. In the end, rockets are complicated and temperamental, and often have minds of their own. So you kind of just have to treat them nicely. To keep learning about rocketry and help ASTRA reach its goals of reaching the Kármán line, be sure to subscribe. And remember to keep expanding your horizons. Yeah, rockets are pretty temperamental. They really don't like to be, everything's got to be just right, you know? They can't just, go with it. Can't launch in the cold weather, can't launch when it's windy, can't launch when there's clouds. My God, when can we launch these things? What are you doing sailing your boat into the restricted zone?